Hello and welcome back to another episode of Science with Mr. Emond. Today we're going to be finishing our unit on the evidence for evolution. Let's get started. Today's topic is going to be speciation. So we know that populations of a species can gradually diverge into separate species via the process of natural selection and evolution. And next unit is going to be looking at natural selection and the theory of natural selection. Let's focus on speciation now. So we know that within a population of any species anywhere, there's genetic variation. And this shouldn't be a shock to you. I mean, we see it in the world everywhere. Typically, this variation is continuous and it follows a normal distribution curve. So we know what distribution curves look like. This is our normal distribution curve. My drawing is kind of horrible, but remember that the peak is at the top of the bell curve, and so this would be the allele of the gene that is most common in the population, and there's other alleles that are present, right, that are probably less common in the population because they're not the ones that lead to the most reproductive success in that environment. And so this variation is continuous and follows a normal distribution curve. And the rate of change is gradual. The change is gradual and ongoing, and it's cumulative, right? The changes build on one another over time. And so let's just look at examples of variation. Right here we have the same species of wolf in the same population, but of course there's differences in eye color and facial feature and size and muscle mass and fur. You know, you look at ducks, right? I think these are ducks, or maybe they're chickens. I don't really know. But you look at whatever, let's call them chickens. So you look at these chicks and what do you see? Well, different feather colors, right? And different eye colors. So there's variation within this, and there's variation everywhere. No matter what you look at, there's variation of genes that lead to different features within individuals of the population. Okay, let's look at this little gimmicky kind of example of a speciation event. So what has happened here? Well, you have a population of turkeys enjoying their nice weather when all of a sudden an earthquake hits and splits the land and creates a river. Wow. And then these turkeys get separated and they can no longer meet each other, which means, they can't reproduce with one another. Well, we know that there's variation within the populations, right? So different colored feathers. This is normal. What would happen if this environment is drastically different than this one? And say, maybe this side of the island is covered in soot because it's near a factory, or just not a factory, but maybe just it's near the city where industrialization is happening, and this is further away, so pollution levels are decreased. Well, what would happen is these turkeys would probably assume colors. Now, I don't mean assume like, hey, I'm going to change my color to gray all of a sudden. No, I mean over time, the individuals that had this gray coloration are going to be the ones that are more likely to survive and pass that gray coloration on to their offspring, right? And so eventually what's going to happen is on this side of the island where the environment is kind of soot covered and it's kind of grayish, right? Maybe the species would change to be that color over time, right? And maybe the genes of these turkeys changed so much as a result of that they're drastically different than the genes of these other turkeys. And if you brought the two together, they would no longer be able to reproduce with one another. Well, if that happens, they're now different species, right? So let's look over the notes here. If two populations of a species become geographically isolated, like this silly example of the turkeys, then they're likely going to be experiencing different ecological conditions. Makes sense. Over time, those two populations would adapt to their different environmental conditions. And if that's the case, they could gradually diverge from one another. Genes so different that they are now unique. They're different from one another. Let's continue on. The degree of the divergence, how far away they split in terms of their genetics, is going to depend on the extent of their separation, geographical separation, and the amount of time since this separation happened. And so we can say populations that are located close together and separated recently, they're probably not going to have less variation in their genes. There's going to be less divergence. Now, populations that get geographically isolated over very large distances, over long periods of time, they're going to show much more variation or more divergence, because more than likely, if they're very far apart, then the environments that they're adapting to are going to be very different from one another. And the more time that passes, because genes mutate at a very constant rate, and we just talked about that in the previous, one of the previous slides, over time, since those genes are changing and accumulating, you end up with very different populations. Let's look at this example. So we're looking at porkfish, okay? And what happened is, at one point in time, there was no Isthmus of Panama. These two areas were actually connected. They were one, right? And so there were porkfish just kind of everywhere in this area. And 3.5 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama rose right here. And this is due to the shifting of tectonic plates. And that separated the two different populations of porkfish. And these populations were no longer able to mix with one another, which means they were no longer able to reproduce with one another. Now, what happened was, this environment is very different than this environment. And these porkfish, because they were adapting to different environments, began to show over the millions of years different traits that were being exhibited due to adaptation to their environment. So you can see that these two porkfish, despite having a common ancestor roughly 4 million years ago, are now very different from one another because they're adapting to those different environments. So one population split. There was a very, very forcible geographic separation in the form of a landmass that arose due to tectonic plate shifting. And thus, this one species of porkfish, the genes changes accumulated over time and led to very different porkfish, where now if you take those two different porkfish and put them in an aquarium together and try to get them to breed, they don't/can't breed with one another. And this has led to one species of porkfish undergoing a speciation event and leading to two different porkfish. So now we have the Anisotremus virginicus, this one, and the Anisotremus tyanetus. You have two different species of porkfish. And so we know that when two species can no longer interbreed and produce fertile, viable offspring, they're separate species. So one species, because of geographic isolation, led to two new species that share a common ancestor. The degree of divergence between geographically separated populations will gradually increase the longer they're separated. The more time goes on, the more divergence there's going to be in terms of the traits and as the genes, and as the genetic divergence between those related populations increase. So as the genes between population 1 and population 2 increase in terms of their differences, well, the compatibility between these two populations whose genes are becoming more and more different, the compatibility is going to decrease. And so when you bring them together, they're not going to be able to reproduce. Eventually, the two populations will diverge so much that they can no longer interbreed, even if they returned to a shared environment. And when that happens, you have a speciation event. So the evolutionary process by which two related populations diverge into separate ones is called speciation. And here's another example in the United States. So you had a geographical isolation event occur where one population of the spotted owl was up in the north and one population of the spotted owl was down in the south, right? And over time, because of the differences in environments and adapting to them and changing things like nesting habits and mating rituals, these two populations, their genes became so different that they can no longer reproduce with one another, and they've become different species. So there's another example for you. This has been actually recreated in the lab too. So a scientist named Diane Dodd, what she did is she took fruit flies and she separated them into different containers, different environments, let's call them. And in one environment, the fruit flies were eating starch food and in another eating maltose food. And over many, many, many generations, what ended up happening is these fruit flies adapted to their new environments, their new food sources. And then what Diane Dodd did after having them separate for a lot of generations is she brought them back together to see if the first steps of speciation have occurred. And they had. What was noticed is that overall, the vast majority of fruit flies would pair with similar environment individuals. So a maltose and a maltose fruit fly, a maltose and a maltose fruit fly, a starch and a starch fruit fly, a starch and a starch fruit fly. Now, this isn't to say that the other one doesn't ever happen. They haven't diverged so much that they're different species, so they can still reproduce and produce viable offspring. We would need many, many, many more generations. Remember, evolution is a very long process. But what this experiment did is it showed the beginning stages. Stages where mating rituals and reproductive habits are starting to take place, where similar environmental fruit flies are interacting with similar environment fruit flies, rather than these different ones who are adapting to different environments. So the beginnings of speciation has occurred. And so let's just review what happens. So you have this common ancestor, right? Maybe it moves into different environments. So this is moving into 4 different environments. And in these 4 different environments, or ecological niches, what's happening is the populations are changing in different ways. So an ancestor splits into 4 different environments, and its genes are changing in different ways because of adapting to different environments or ecological niches. Now, over millions of years, what can happen is that ancestor becomes 4 different species that are similar. Like, obviously, we can see there's similarities between, I'm going to assume this is a jaguar. It's a weird looking jaguar, and a lion, and a cheetah, and a domestic cat, right? There's similarities between them, but of course, their genes are very different because they've been adapting to different environments. So although they came from a common ancestor, they're very different today because of that process. And so one species diverged into, in this case, we're demonstrating 4, but really we know that there's way more types, species of cats that exist today than these 4 that originated from a common ancestor. Let's look at this other example. So this is from Berkeley's website. And this is their example of how speciation happens. So if populations like fruit flies become separated, and so in this case, it's because of a storm that blows a population of fruit flies to a different island, an island that's very different, then it's likely that the population on this new island will experience different ecological conditions. And over many generations, the shape of the flies, the food preference, the mating rituals, all these things are going to likely diverge as a result of natural selection. So you'll have fruit flies that are eating this fruit and fruit flies that are eating this fruit. Their mating rituals might be different. Their shape, colors might be different. And if by some fluke that fruit fly on the weird island migrates back to the mainland, they'll likely not easily mate with the mainland flies. And that's because those mating rituals are different, right? Well, one of the things might be the mating rituals are different. So fruit fly on the mainland's doing its little dance saying, hey, come mate with me. And the island fruit fly is looking at that fruit fly going, what kind of dance is that? You look dumb. I'm not coming to mate with you. Because mating rituals might be different, they don't want to mate with one another because their rituals are wrong. Or it could be, just plain genetics. If enough time goes by, the genes of the different populations will diverge so much that this could result in infertile offspring. And because genes cannot flow between populations, the island fruit flies are said to have evolved into a separate species, especially if the offspring are infertile, right? Or they don't reproduce at all. They've become new species. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is take a look at this video. Now this video is about the finches on the Galapagos Islands, and it's one of the famous examples of speciation. And this is an example that Charles Darwin himself observed. And so Charles Darwin is the scientist who came up with the theory of natural selection. And he went on a voyage when he was young where he traveled around the world visiting many different environments and ecosystems all over the world. And what he observed is that when you travel around the world and see different areas, in general, those species that you observe are going to be very well adapted to their environment. And he could kind of see, well, if I move them off the island into where I'm from, they probably wouldn't survive very well. But where they are here, they're surviving very well because they're adapted to that specific environment. And then he started seeing clusters, like different islands that are different from one another, but fairly close together. And there was birds on the island and turtles and other species that are very well adapted to that island, but they're still very similar to the birds on another nearby island that's different. And so he had stumbled upon examples of speciation where one, for example, in this case, finch population might have traveled to the different islands and stayed on the different islands. And over time, as they adapted to those islands, they became different species, but they're still finches and still share similarities with one another. And so this speciation example is a great one. And this video, who you can find the link for right here, will demonstrate this very well. So click this link, watch the video, and come back here when you're done. Welcome back. Okay, the last thing I want to do today is look at the example of the peppered moth. So what we're going to be doing is actually doing a lab report for this. It's a simulation, so everybody can do it from home. And what's happening here is, in England, there was something called a peppered moth, and species name Biston betularia. And there's two forms of it. There's this, I'm trying to highlight it here if you couldn't see the moth before. There's this moth here, which has a white coloration pattern with dark spots, right? And this is the insularia version of the moth. And its version is well camouflaged for the pale covered lichens that exist in most areas of England. And these moths fly at night to try to find a mate, but during the day they rest on the branches. And it's when they're resting on the branches that they can get eaten by birds and other animals. And so this white coloration, the insularia pattern, helps them camouflage and avoid predation. Now, what happened in England is they went through the Industrial Revolution, which you probably learned about. And in the Industrial Revolution, the environment changed a lot as a result of sulfur dioxide emissions, which killed the lichens that produced this white color and covered the trees in soot. And this led to different forests becoming changed from light colored trees to dark colored trees from the coal burning and the sulfur dioxide blackening the trees. And the result of this is these white colored variants within the population now trying to live on these dark trees, while you could imagine not going to help you camouflage. And so when black moths, they of course they exist, like with variation in populations, you're going to have moths of all different colors, and right? But the white with the black spots is going to be the most abundant form because it leads to the highest rates of survival. And normally these black moths would just be decimated on these white trees. But with that environmental change, all of a sudden they became very successful. And so the dark moths, now being very camouflaged, were able to survive and reproduce, when before they likely didn't even make it to adulthood where they could reproduce because they just get eaten right away. And conversely, the light colored moths, who usually would be the highest chance of survival and passing on their genes, were now getting eaten alive trying to live on these dark trees. And very few survive to reproduce. And so what's happening is, in these forests that are overall dark trees, we're seeing a speciation event occur. Now, there's still these light colored forests where these insularia versions are doing very well. But in these forests that are dark, over the generations that we've observed, this carbonaria version is the one that's being selected for, this dark colored. And this form of the peppered moth has increased with frequency, leading to the heritable characteristics of the population changing. And the genes within these populations are actually changing over time. And what we're predicting is going to happen is that these two populations, their genes, will change so much that there'll be two different species of moths that came from an original ancestor. So they won't be Biston betularia anymore. This one will still be Biston betularia, but this one will have changed so much that we'll have to give it a new name if it can no longer reproduce with the original species. And so we're going to be doing an activity. So for those of you on YouTube, you can find this link here and try out the activity. For those of you in my class, though, what I'd like you to do is go to Schoology. And in Schoology, you will find in the Life and Evolution folder, in LE1, the last thing that we're going to do is this peppered moth assignment. And so if you click this link and open the peppered moth activity, you will find here is your assignment. And what you're going to do is you're going to answer these questions about the moths and the impacts of pollution and Kettlewell's experiments. And you might be going, where am I going to find this information? You're not supposed to Google it. When you click this link, peppermoths.weebly.com, you will find within all of these, the life cycle, the impact of pollution, and Kettlewell's experiments, you will find the answers to all those questions. So read through this, and this will provide you with the answers to those questions. Now, one other thing to note is that you are going to be asked to do the bird's eye view. So this is doing the actual simulation this time. And notice we have a table that we're going to be filling out, one for the light forest, one for the dark forest. And what you're doing is you're going to put the percent of dark moths and light moths that are going to be surviving at the end of your simulation for both types of forest, and then the final analysis. So to do that, under the bird's eye view here, what you're going to do is read the instructions, and your role's that of a predator, and you basically just go to the light forest, go to the dark forest, do the simulation, and eat the things that catch your eyes. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Thanks for watching, everybody. You can like, follow, and subscribe to my social medias to get notifications as soon as new content is uploaded. In the top corner here, you will find the playlist that this video is in. Watch the unit from beginning to end, and over here, you will find the next video in this unit. Keep learning, everybody. Take care.